The race that made Ayrton Senna world champion. In the long and dramatic history of Formula One, there are races that define entire careers, moments where a single afternoon on a racetrack changes the destiny of a driver forever. For many champions, greatness is built over seasons, through consistency, strategy, and years of development. But sometimes greatness is revealed in a single race, a race where talent, courage, and determination collide in a way that the world will never forget. One of those races happened on October 30th, 1988, at a circuit on the edge of the Pacific Ocean in Japan. A track that had already built a reputation for demanding perfection from every driver who dared to compete there. The track was the legendary, and the driver who would make history that day was a young Brazilian named. But the story of the race does not begin in Japan. It begins months earlier, inside the most dominant Formula One team the sport had ever seen. The most powerful team in Formula One. The 1988 Formula One season was unlike any other. At the center of it all was a team that had built a car so advanced, so powerful, and so perfectly engineered that the rest of the grid seemed almost powerless to stop it. That team was the McLaren MP4/4 was not just fast, it was revolutionary. Powered by a turbocharged Honda engine, the car produced enormous power while maintaining exceptional reliability. Combined with brilliant aerodynamic design and world-class engineering, the MP4/4 quickly became the most dominant car Formula One had ever seen. But McLaren's greatest strength was not just the machine. It was the two men sitting inside the cockpits. On one side of the garage was the experienced and calculating French driver. By 1988, Prost was already a two-time world champion. Known throughout the paddock as the Professor, he had built his reputation on intelligence, strategy, and incredible race management. Prost was not always the fastest driver over one lap, but he was almost always the smartest. He understood tire management, fuel strategy, and race pacing better than anyone else in Formula One. And for years, that had made him one of the most successful drivers in the sport. But in 1988, McLaren hired a new driver. A driver who would change everything. His name was Ayrton Senna. The arrival of Ayrton Senna. When Ayrton Senna joined McLaren in 1988, the Formula One world already knew that he was special. His performances with smaller teams had revealed extraordinary speed, especially in qualifying sessions. Senna possessed a rare ability to extract every last ounce of performance from a car. His qualifying laps were often so precise, so aggressive, and so fast that even experienced engineers struggled to understand how he managed it. But joining McLaren meant something very different. Now Senna had the fastest car on the grid, and now he had to race against Alain Prost. Inside the McLaren garage, there were two completely different personalities. Prost was calm, analytical, and politically intelligent. Senna was intense, emotional, and spiritually driven. Where Prost calculated risks, Senna attacked them. Where Prost waited for opportunities, Senna created them. At first, the team believed the two drivers could coexist peacefully. But Formula One has a long history of turning teammates into rivals. And this partnership would soon become one of the most famous rivalries the sport had ever seen. A season of total domination. As the 1988 season unfolded, it quickly became clear that McLaren had built a car that no other team could match. Race after race, the MP4/4 dominated the grid. Out of the first 16 races of the season, McLaren would eventually win 15. It was a level of dominance rarely seen in any sport, and almost every one of those victories belonged to either Senna or Prost. The championship quickly became an internal battle. Prost relied on his experience and consistency. Senna relied on pure speed. Throughout the season, the two drivers traded victories, pushing each other to extraordinary levels of performance. But despite Prost's experience, Senna had a powerful advantage: his qualifying speed. Again and again, Senna placed the McLaren on pole position, and on many circuits, starting from the front meant controlling the entire race. Still, Prost remained a dangerous opponent, because while Senna often started first, Prost often finished first. The championship battle grew closer and more intense with every race. And by the time the season reached its final stages, the title fight was heading toward a dramatic conclusion. A conclusion that would take place in Japan, at Suzuka. Suzuka, a driver's circuit. Among Formula One drivers, Suzuka had a special reputation. Unlike many circuits designed primarily for spectacle, Suzuka demanded precision and courage. The track twisted through a series of challenging corners, elevation changes, and high-speed sections that punished even the smallest mistake. One of the most unique features of Suzuka was its figure-8 layout, where one section of the circuit passed over another via a bridge. Drivers loved the circuit because it rewarded true skill. Every corner required perfect balance. Every braking zone demanded total concentration. And at racing speeds, the margin for error was almost non-existent. For the drivers competing for the championship, Suzuka would provide the ultimate test. By the time the Formula One paddock arrived in Japan for the 1988 Japanese Grand Prix, the championship battle had become simple. If Ayrton Senna won the race, he would become world champion. But if Alain Prost finished ahead of him, the title fight would continue. The stage was set. The world was watching. And no one could have predicted what would happen next. The pole position. As the Formula One paddock settled into the rhythm of race weekend at E, one thing quickly became clear. The McLaren cars were once again faster than everyone else. Throughout practice sessions, the two drivers have dominated the timing sheets. Their Honda-powered machines seemed perfectly suited for the fast, flowing nature of Suzuka. But as always, the real battle was not between McLaren and the rest of the grid. It was between the two men wearing the same racing suit. On one side of the garage stood the experienced French champion. On the other side stood the intensely focused Brazilian challenger. Both men knew exactly what was at stake. For Prost, the Japanese Grand Prix represented one more opportunity to defend his position as the leader inside the team. He had already won multiple championships and was determined to prove that experience still mattered. For Senna, Suzuka represented something even bigger: the chance to become world champion for the first time. During qualifying, the tension between the two drivers could almost be felt in the air. When the engines fired up and the cars left the pit lane, the atmosphere changed instantly. Every lap mattered. Every sector could decide the outcome of the championship. Prost was smooth and precise as always. His lap times were strong, consistent, and intelligent, but Senna was something else entirely. When the Brazilian driver pushed the car to its limit, it looked almost supernatural. The McLaren danced through Suzuka's corners with incredible speed, barely touching the edges of control. Sector after sector, Senna found time where others could not. The final result was clear. Ayrton Senna secured pole position. Once again, he had placed the McLaren at the very front of the grid. For Senna, this was the perfect starting point. For Prost, it meant something more dangerous. If Senna controlled the race from the front, the championship could end that very afternoon. The quiet war inside McLaren. Despite their dominance on track, the atmosphere inside the McLaren garage was far from peaceful. Throughout the 1988 season, the relationship between Senna and Prost had slowly deteriorated. At first, there had been mutual respect. Prost admired Senna's raw speed. Senna respected Prost's intelligence and racecraft. But Formula One has a way of turning teammates into rivals. Every pole position by Senna created pressure for Prost. Every strategic victory by Prost frustrated Senna. Small disagreements inside the team began to grow larger. Both drivers believed they were the true leader of McLaren. And as the championship battle intensified, the psychological warfare between them became more visible. At Suzuka, that tension reached a boiling point. Both men understood that this race would define the season, and neither of them intended to lose. Race day. On the morning of October 30th, 1988, thousands of fans filled the grandstands at Suzuka. The excitement was enormous. Although the championship was being decided between two drivers from the same team, the entire
And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds.
Greatest drivers
and
of their
it is
generation.
Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10 seconds. And it is Senna gets web, Prost by 10.
He had the best starting position, and he had the opportunity to win the championship with a single victory. But Formula One rarely follows the script. And sometimes, the most dramatic moments happen when everything goes wrong. The start that changed everything. As the red lights illuminated above the grid, the tension inside the cockpit of Senna's car was unbearable. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The Honda engine roared behind him. In just a few seconds, the race would begin. The lights went out, and suddenly, disaster struck. Senna's car stalled. For a brief moment, the McLaren stopped moving entirely. In Formula One, even a small delay at the start can destroy an entire race. But this was far worse. As the other cars launched forward, Senna's McLaren remained motionless on the grid. The championship dream that had seemed so close only seconds earlier now appeared to be slipping away. Cars rushed past him from both sides. Driver after driver blasted down the straight, leaving Senna behind. Finally, the engine caught. The McLaren surged forward, but the damage was done. From pole position, Ayrton Senna had fallen almost to the back of the field. For most drivers, that would have been the end of the race. At Suzuka, overtaking was extremely difficult. Climbing through the entire field would require something extraordinary. Inside the McLaren garage, engineers watched in disbelief. Prost had taken the lead. Senna was buried deep in the pack. The championship appeared to be decided. But Ayrton Senna was not finished, not even close. Because what happened next would become one of the most incredible comeback drives in the entire history of Formula One. The comeback begins. When Ayrton Senna finally got his car moving after the disastrous start, he knew immediately what the situation looked like. From pole position, he had fallen almost to the back of the field. Cars surrounded him on every side as the pack charged into the first corners of Suzuka. The championship that had seemed so close only seconds earlier was suddenly slipping away. But inside the cockpit, Senna did not panic. Instead, something else took over. Focus. For many drivers, losing so many positions at the start would destroy their confidence. The natural reaction would be frustration, maybe even desperation. But Ayrton Senna was different. He had spent years preparing himself mentally for moments exactly like this. And now, with the championship on the line, he began doing what he did best, driving faster than anyone else on the track. The first laps, by the end of the first lap, the race had already split into two very different stories. At the front, Alain Prost led comfortably. From his perspective, everything was going according to plan. The start had worked perfectly. His biggest rival was now trapped deep in the field. All Prost needed to do was control the pace and avoid mistakes. Behind him, the field settled into its rhythm, but further back, one driver had begun a mission. Senna started attacking immediately. Suzuka was not an easy circuit for overtaking. Its high-speed corners and narrow racing line meant drivers had to take enormous risks to pass another car. But Senna seemed willing to take those risks. Corner after corner, he searched for opportunities, under braking, on corner exits, through sections where most drivers would never attempt to move. And slowly the positions began to change. One car passed, then another, and another. Within only a few laps, Senna had already climbed several places. The crowd began to notice. Something unusual was happening. A different kind of speed. What made Senna's recovery so extraordinary was not just the overtakes, it was the pace. Even while fighting traffic, Senna was driving faster than almost everyone else on the circuit. His lap times began dropping rapidly. Inside the McLaren garage, engineers watched the timing screens carefully. At first, they thought the numbers might be wrong, but the data was clear. Senna was producing lap times that were competitive with the leaders, even while overtaking slower cars. It was a level of performance that bordered on unbelievable. Each lap, he gained another position. Each lap, the gap to the front became smaller. And somewhere ahead, Alain Prost was beginning to realize that the race might not be over yet. The rhythm of Suzuka. To understand how Senna managed this recovery, it's important to understand the nature of the Suzuka circuit. Unlike many tracks where overtaking happens mostly on long straights, Suzuka rewards drivers who can maintain speed through its complex sequence of corners. The famous S-curves in the first sector demand absolute precision. The driver must change direction rapidly, carrying as much speed as possible without losing control. Then comes the long, sweeping corners like spoon curve, where throttle control and balance become critical. Finally, the fast run toward the Casio triangle chicane offers one of the few real overtaking opportunities. For a driver with extraordinary car control, Suzuka could become a weapon. And Ayrton Senna was one of the greatest masters of car control the sport had ever seen. While other drivers approached the corners cautiously, Senna attacked them with relentless precision. He carried more speed, braked later, accelerated earlier. Every corner became an opportunity to close the gap. The field begins to fall. As the race progressed, the recovery became impossible to ignore. One by one, the cars ahead of Senna began to fall behind him. Some drivers tried to defend their position, but defending against Senna on that day was almost impossible. His moves were decisive, aggressive, and perfectly timed. When he attacked under braking, he committed completely. When he exited a corner with better traction, he used every inch of the track. There was no hesitation, only speed. By the middle of the race, Senna had climbed from near the back of the grid into the top positions. The grandstands at Suzuka began to erupt with excitement. Even the Japanese fans, who had arrived expecting a simple championship fight between two McLaren drivers, realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was no longer just a race. It was a comeback. And it was becoming one of the most incredible drives Formula One had ever seen. Prost watches the timing screens. At the front of the race, Alain Prost remained calm, outwardly at least. He continued to lead, managing his pace with the same intelligence that had earned him the nickname the Professor. But inside the cockpit, Prost was watching the pit boards carefully. Each lap, the numbers told a story. Senna was coming. The gap that had once seemed enormous was shrinking. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds. Prost understood exactly what that meant. If Senna reached him, the race would turn into a direct fight, and if Senna won the race, he would become world champion. For the first time that afternoon, the pressure shifted. The man who had seemed certain to lose the race was now chasing victory, and the man who had seemed certain to win now had to defend it. The championship comes back to life. By the final third of the race, Senna had already completed one of the most impressive recoveries in Formula One history. But the most difficult part still remained, because ahead of him was the one driver who knew him better than anyone else, Alain Prost. The two McLaren teammates were now on a collision course, one driver leading the race, the other charging forward with unstoppable momentum. And the championship would be decided when they finally met on track. The chase. As the race entered its final phase, the tension at Suzuka reached an entirely new level. The impossible comeback was becoming reality. Lap after lap, Ayrton Senna continued to close the gap to Alain Prost. What had once been a distant target on the horizon was now clearly visible ahead. The red and white McLaren of Prost appeared in Senna's sight. For the Brazilian driver, this moment was everything. Only hours earlier, his championship hopes had nearly vanished after the stalled start. The world had assumed the race was over before it had truly begun. But now, after an extraordinary recovery drive through the field, Senna had done the unthinkable. He had caught the race leader, and that leader was his teammate. Inside the cockpit, Senna remained intensely focused. There was no celebration yet, because the hardest part still remained. Passing Alain Prost. Two different minds. To understand the drama of this moment, it's important to remember how different these two drivers were. Was a master of strategy. He rarely made mistakes. He managed tires and fuel with surgical precision. And he always knew exactly how much risk was necessary and how much was not. On the other hand, raced with pure intensity. Where Prost calculated, Senna attacked. Where Prost waited, Senna forced the moment. These opposing philosophies had defined their rivalry throughout the entire 1988 season. And now, at Suzuka, the championship would be decided by which philosophy proved stronger: the calm precision of Prost, or the relentless determination of Senna. The moment arrives. As Senna moved closer, the gap between the two McLaren cars shrank to just a few seconds. The engineers at McLaren watched the timing screens in silence. This was the situation they had both hoped for and feared. Two teammates, two championship contenders, both capable of winning. The entire season now depended on what would happen in the next few laps. On the track, Prost knew Senna was coming. He pushed harder, trying to maintain his lead. But Senna's pace was relentless. Every corner of Suzuka seemed to suit him perfectly. Through the famous S-curves, the Brazilian carried incredible speed. At Spoon Curve, he closed even further. And down the long straight toward the Casio Triangle chicane, the gap became small enough for an attack. The moment had arrived. The overtake! With perfect precision, Senna positioned his car behind Prost. He studied the French driver's lines through the final corners. He waited, And then when the opportunity appeared, he struck. Using the power of the Honda engine, Senna accelerated hard out of the corner and moved alongside Prost. The two McLarens raced side by side down the straight. For a brief moment, it was the ultimate image of Formula One. Two teammates, two rivals, two of the greatest drivers in history, and only one of them would emerge in front. Under braking, Senna committed to the inside line, later than almost anyone would dare. The car slowed just enough. The tires gripped, and the move was complete. Ayrton Senna had taken the lead. The final laps. Once Senna moved ahead, the race changed completely. For Prost, the situation was suddenly clear. If Senna won the race, he would become world champion. But catching him again would be extremely difficult, because when Senna led a race, he often became even faster. The Brazilian pushed with extraordinary focus during the final laps. Every corner was taken with absolute precision. Every straight was attacked with full power. Behind him, Prost continued to chase, but the gap slowly began to grow. The comeback was complete from a stalled start on the grid. From near the back of the field, Ayrton Senna was now leading the Japanese Grand Prix. And the World Championship was within reach. The checkered flag. Finally, after one of the most dramatic races in Formula One history, the moment arrived. The checkered flag waved at the end of the race. Ayrton Senna crossed the finish line first. The victory secured his first Formula One World Championship. The crowd at Suzuka erupted with excitement. Even many of the Japanese fans, who had no national driver in the fight, recognized the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. It was not just a victory. It was one of the greatest comeback drives the sport had ever seen, from disaster to triumph, from stalled on the grid to world champion. At that moment, Ayrton Senna did not just win a race, he became a legend. The moment of realization. As Ayrton Senna crossed the finish line at Suzuka, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Just over an hour earlier, the race had started in disaster. From pole position, his car had stalled on the grid. In Formula One, a mistake like that usually ends any hope of victory. But what followed was something the sport rarely sees: an extraordinary comeback. One position after another, lap after lap of relentless speed. And finally, the decisive overtake that secured the lead. Now, as Senna slowed the car on the cool-down lap, he knew the truth. He was the 1988 Formula One World Champion. For the Brazilian driver, this was not just a professional achievement. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Since childhood, Senna had believed that racing was his destiny. Every sacrifice, every early morning in karting, every difficult season climbing the ladder of motorsport, all of it had led to this moment. A different kind of champion. What made Senna's victory so powerful was not only the result, it was the way he achieved it. Many champions win titles through careful strategy and consistency across an entire season. Senna had done something more dramatic. He had won the championship through one of the greatest drives in the history of the sport, starting from near the back of the field and climbing all the way to victory at a circuit as demanding as Suzuka required extraordinary talent. But it also revealed something deeper about the Brazilian driver: his mindset. Even after the disastrous start, Senna never accepted defeat. Instead of frustration, he responded with determination. Instead of panic, he focused on what he could still control. Lap by lap, corner by corner, he turned a disaster into triumph. That mentality would become one of the defining characteristics of his career: Prost's perspective. For Alain Prost, the race ended very differently. Although he finished second, The result meant that the championship had slipped away, but Prost understood exactly what had happened. He knew better than anyone how fast Senna could be. And on that day in Suzuka, Senna had delivered one of the most extraordinary performances Formula One had ever seen. The rivalry between the two men was far from over. In fact, the events of the 1988 season would only intensify their competition. Over the next few years, their battles would become some of the most famous and controversial moments in Formula One history. But in 1988, the title belonged to Senna. The legacy of Suzuka, 1988. Decades later, the 1988 Japanese Grand Prix is still remembered as one of the greatest races ever run. Not because of a dramatic crash, not because of unpredictable weather, but because of a comeback that seemed impossible. For fans of Formula One, the race represents something fundamental about the sport. Racing is not only about the fastest car, it is about the human being inside the cockpit, the courage to push beyond limits, the ability to remain calm under pressure, and the determination to fight even when the odds seem overwhelming. At Suzuka in 1988, Ayrton Senna showed the world exactly what that looks like. The beginning of a legend. Winning the 1988 championship was only the beginning. Over the next few years, Senna would continue building his legacy as one of the greatest drivers in the history of Formula One. His qualifying speed, his performances in the rain, his intense rivalry with Prost. All of these moments would shape the legend that millions of fans still admire today. But every legend has a defining chapter. For Ayrton Senna, one of those chapters was written on the asphalt of Suzuka, on a day when a stalled start could have ended everything. Instead, it created one of the most unforgettable victories the sport has ever seen. Final narration. Perfect ending for the video. And that is why the 1988 Japanese Grand Prix remains so special. It wasn't just a race. It was a demonstration of what makes motorsport extraordinary. Because sometimes the greatest champions are not defined by the moments when everything goes right. They are defined by how they respond when everything goes wrong. On that day in Japan, Ayrton Senna showed the world exactly what a champion looks like.